Okay, this talk is about the beat writers, principally Jack Kerouac, William Boas, and Allen Ginsberg, and how their activities and writings in the late 1940s and 50s prefigured and influenced the psychedelic movement, which came into flowering a generation later. As you can imagine, when the psychedelic movement got underway in the 60s, the Beats were naturally looked upon as mentor figures and elder statesmen, and Timothy Leary, who was of the same age group as them, was happy to recruit them and induct them into the cause through his Harvard program. Now, this produced some unexpected and volatile results. Tim Leary actually got a lot more than he bargained for. And the end product, as regards the three major beat writers, was one spectacular success, one mixed case, good in parts you might say, and one spectacular failure. But more of that later. Firstly, let's spool back to New York in 1943 and the Columbia University scene where the Beats first hooked up. At that time, Jack Kerouac was in his early 20s and he already saw himself as a writer. Bill Boas was older, in his late 20s, and he was known as a raconteur, an intellectual, and he became a mentor figure to the group. Allen Ginsberg was the kid, still a teenager, and just enrolled at Columbia. There were other key people in the group, such as Lucien Carr and other students, and all of them, everybody eventually became fictionalized in Kerouac's novels, the most famous of which is On the Road. Now, at around this same time, Bill Boas first tried morphine and became an addict. So the events of his first novel, Junkie, run roughly concurrently to On the Road. In both books, which are strongly autobiographical, there are many references to recreational drug use. And those two books open a marvelous window onto pre-psychedelic bohemian life, exactly the kind of scene that would eventually develop into what we call the hippie scene. A few years later, in 1946, Neal Cassady came to New York, met Kerouac and Ginsberg, and the early beat circle was just about complete. That's Cassady on the left there, next to Kerouac. Now, Cassady is another very important figure in both the beats and the psychedelic movement, and although he wasn't a developed writer, he was a terrific character and a great improvisational talker, and he undoubtedly influenced Kerouac's writing style, his spontaneous prose style, with his improvisational talking. And Cassady also became Kerouac's muse, and he was the lead character in On the Road, Dean Moriarty. So Kerouac was a kind of Boswell to Cassady's Johnson in that. Now, in On the Road, drug use is referred to matter-of-factly as a normal part of life. And as well as marijuana, called tea or weed, Benzodrine figures highly as a drug of choice in the 40s and 50s bohemian scene. And it was then available legally in the form of inhalers. Boas describes Benzodrine use in Junkie, and Kerouac wrote the legendary first draft of On the Road in 3 weeks on a continuous roll of paper whilst high on Benzodrine. And in many ways, that act and its relentless speed-driven energy came to define the spirit of the 50s scene, much as Timothy Leary's acid-inspired pronouncements defined the 60s. So Benzodrine and other amphetamines were the standout recreational drugs of the 40s and 50s, much as it was acid in the 60s and 70s and MDMA in the 80s and 90s. And the Beats, like many drug users, were pretty omnivorous when it came to experimenting. They all tried opiates, for example, but it was only Boas who became a confirmed addict. As for psychedelics in this era, the only well-known about and readily available one for Americans was the peyote cactus, and they did all try peyote early. Bill Boas writes about it in Junkie. Now, this was now the dawn of the 1950s, and Bill had fled to Mexico, escaping US law enforcement after several busts. He was now aged around 36, so he's getting on a bit even at this time. And he talks of a younger generation of American hipsters who were living cheaply in Mexico. And it was with these guys that Bill first tried peyote. Typically, he felt sick and vomited, and the peyote clogged his throat. And he compares the high to benzotrine, but with surreal undertones. Everything I saw looked like a peyote plant, he says. But for him, it wasn't an epoch-making psychedelic experience. That was to come later. Now, the peyote episode was near the end of the novel Junkie, which describes a journey, both geographical in moving around America and Mexico, and experiential in the various drugs that he tried, not only opiates, but benzodrine, peyote, marijuana, etc. And at the very end of the book, Bill sets up the next stage of the journey. And now it's particularly fascinating from our point of view in the present here to see what he was onto way back at the start of the 1950s. And of course, it was nothing less than ayahuasca, or yahe. Though when writing about it, Bill missed the accent off the E and called it yage. And the subsequent book that came out sometime later was called the Yeats Letters. Now, this is a book of two halves. The first half is Boas' adventures in 1953, and the second is Ginsberg's in 1960. And it's written in an epistolatory way as actual letters, but the letters are fictionalized. They're not the real letters that were written at the time. Now, yahe was hardly known about in the West back in the early 50s. There were the writings of Richard Spruce and Louis Lewin, but what really sparked Boas' interest was the Colombian scientist Rafael Zerda-Bayon and his experiments, and the fact that he named, speculatively, the active ingredient of ayahuasca as telepathy. And this was after he gave some to a soldier, and the soldier had visions of his sister dying, which were later confirmed as accurate. Now, Bill Boas was a total believer in the magical universe. He was into the occult, spells, divination, etc. So it was this aspect of yahe that particularly attracted him, the telepathic. And by singling it out for entheogenic reasons, he was way ahead of his time. Though at that time, at the time of writing Junkie, he still expressed it in hip 50s talk. So this is the final paragraph of Junkie, using Boas' original pronunciation, yage. Kick is seeing things from a special angle. Kick is momentary freedom from the claims of the aging, cautious, nagging, frightened flesh. Maybe I will find in yage what I have been looking for in junk and weed and coke. Yage may be the final fix. So, Bill Boas conducted several expeditions around South America. The first is described in the novel Queer, that's his second novel, but that expedition wasn't successful as he couldn't find the right people to help him amongst the locals. But he returned in 1953, and this time he had a lucky break, an extraordinary, fortuitous coincidence, you might say. He happened to go into Bogota University to get some information on yahe, and there he just happened to bump into another hugely important figure in the history of the psychedelic movement. And this was the botanist Richard Evans Schultes, who was the pioneer of ethnobotany and actually the #1 living authority on hallucinogenic plants in the Americas. So if you want to meet somebody to tell you what to do, he's exactly the right person to meet. Boas and Schultes were both Harvard men, almost contemporaries, so that played a part in them hitting it off. And Schultes told Bill what he knew about ayahuasca, how it's prepared, and the tribal mythology surrounding its use. And later on, the two embarked on an expedition into the Putumayo, where Bill finally had his definitive experiences of the brew. Now, without Schultes, Bill would have remained clueless about how to proceed, as there was no precedent for what he was doing. In fact, it puzzled Schultes himself as to why a Western writer who wasn't a scientist should travel all this way just to sample a native drug. But of course now, in our present age, everybody's doing it. And so Bill Boas could be rightly termed one of the first ever ayahuasca tourists. And his use of ayahuasca is being re-evaluated in the light of the new interest in the substance. Now, Boas did eventually find what he was looking for in ayahuasca, though the path was rocky, involving one considerable overdose that left him legless and retching violently and overcome with intense hallucinations. But as an experienced drug misadventurer, he knew what to do, and he managed to bring himself back down with barbiturates. Another interesting fact is that from another brew home, Bill actually discovered the correct formula for the ayahuasca brew, which includes, as well as the ayahuasca plant, chacruna, which functions as an MAOI inhibitor, activating the DMT in the ayahuasca and essential for the proper full experience. Now, at the time, not even Schultes knew this, but apparently he took credit for it later. So that's another interesting factor about Boas in the evolution of what we know about ayahuasca. With this same brew home, Bill had his breakthrough life-changing trip, and he concluded ayahuasca was every bit as special as he'd hoped. He said that it caused him to experience a new state of being, where he left behind the entire structure of pragmatic, result-seeking, use-seeking, question-asking Western thought. So it was indeed, as he said, the final fix. The creative fruit of that experience can be found in Boas's final Yeats letter in his section of the book. And that same passage also appears minimally edited in Naked Lunch. And the importance of ayahuasca as a catalyst to creative innovation in that book and in his future cut-up novels cannot be overstated. In Rimbaud's famous words, that a poet must reach the unknown by means of a derangement of all the senses, which the Beats aspired to, it was ayahuasca, as much as heroin or anything else, that was responsible for this in Bill Boas's case. As for the Yeats Letters itself, it became a highly significant psychedelic text, eventually introducing the next generation to the substance in its shamanic context, at the same time as information about LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin was starting to circulate. In fact, it was the Yeats Letters that went on to inspire Terence and Dennis McKenna in their own journey to the Amazon and led to their book, The Invisible Landscape. And Ralph Metzner has observed the importance of the Yeats Letters in his writings on ayahuasca. Okay, moving on to Allen Ginsberg. There he is, as a fairly young man. Now, he was very much the kid of the original 40s beat scene, but he grew in stature and status through the 50s. He became a leading figure in the San Francisco poetry renaissance, with his poem Howl gaining fame as a seminal beat work. As the 60s progressed, Allen, unlike Bill Boas and Jack Kerouac, changed his appearance accordingly, adopting long hair and a bushy beard to become the hippie guru figure that loomed large in the developing countercultural scene. Now, Allen himself was naturally predisposed towards cosmic visions. He had one through reading William Blake, and he had one through having nitrous oxides at the dentist's. So when he got the chance to try LSD in a mental research experiment, which we now found out was the CIA was behind it, wasn't it? He was full of enthusiasm. His first trip was very positive, which reignited his visionary perspective, and he went on to repeat the experience. In a letter he says, "This drug seems to automatically produce a mystical experience. Science is getting very hip." Shortly afterwards, in 1960, Allen undertook a 6-month trip to South America, primarily to take ayahuasca, following in Bill Boas's footsteps, and gathering the material for his half of the Yeats Letters. His experiences were very profound, destabilizing, and sometimes horrifying. ayahuasca took him far beyond the range of LSD. He confronted death, body-soul duality, and the nature of God. But he developed a fear of madness and of entering a permanently changed universe from which he couldn't escape. Alan, though, was very tenacious in his belief in the larger transforming possibilities of psychedelics, and he had the chutzpah to take the bad trips along with the good and continue his quest. The next step forward came when Alan met Timothy Leary and participated in one of his Harvard psilocybin experiments. This was the beginning of a beautiful friendship and the most important point of fusion of the beat movement and the psychedelic movement. As for Alan's trip, it started shakily with some of his ayahuasca fears returning, but then he reached the turning point. After seeing a flash of light, another of his classic euphoric visions began to construct. Alan was overcome with a sense that the cosmos was waiting for a Messiah. And naturally enough, he felt that the Messiah was him, as you do, of course, with the right stimulus. He took all his clothes off and came downstairs naked and declared himself the Messiah to Leary and all the others who were gathered, who took it with a bit of a pinch of salt because they'd done plenty of psilocybin experiments and they'd seen this kind of thing before. But then he and Timothy began to mastermind the next stage of the psychedelic revolution. Alan and Timothy decided that a series of well-established figures in the arts should be invited to try psilocybin as part of the research project. Such people would hopefully endorse it and give it wider publicity and respectability at the same time. They included painters and jazz musicians like Dizzy Gillespie and Thelonious Monk. But top of the list was Alan's old friend and fellow beat, good old Jack Kerouac. There he is. So you might think that here was another epoch-making moment, a meeting of two big personalities, Leary and Kerouac, who was now famous as a result of On the Road. All of it crystallized in the beauty of a shared psilocybin experience. But it was not to be. By now, Jack's life was seriously off kilter, and he'd become a raging alcoholic and was known for going on marathon drinking binges of huge excess and also for drunken bad behaviour. As Alan knew, he could be a complete loose cannon in a social situation. Anyway, thanks to Leary's writings, we have his views on all of the beats, including first impressions, having met them when they were fully established figures. So that's a different, useful perspective. And Leary's view of Jack was that he was a scary guy. His opening gambit was to ask Timothy what he was doing with a communist faggot like Ginsberg, and then to challenge Tim's psychedelic absolution with the notion of Jesus Christ as saviour. Of course, Jack was drunk and was enjoying baiting Tim, and he continued to rant away in barroom fashion, which is hardly the right approach to an upcoming psilocybin session. Now, Alan himself was used to all this, and he was a Buddhist, and he was forgiven of Jack's bigoted reactionary side. But it was all completely new to Tim Leary, and Jack's drunken belligerence sent Tim off into a rare bad trip where he became depressed and introspective. And when the psilocybin took hold and displaced the alcohol, Jack too had a negative trip, becoming paranoid and regressing back to his stay in a Navy psychiatric ward. That's a US government Navy picture of Kerouac. And his subsequent discharge from the service. His final revelation was, everybody is full of shit. So he didn't get an awful lot out of psilocybin, really. But nevertheless, sometime later, the two of them, Leary and Kerouac, did have another trip. After another series of crises, Jack was looking for an antidote, and he met Tim again. And this time he obtained a dozen psilocybe mexicana mushrooms from him, which he ate before accompanying Tim on a walk around the Lower East Side of New York. The trip was initially euphoric, and Jack felt liberated from his current torments. But as is sometimes the case with psilocybin, too much clarity can become unbearable, and Jack had to face the truth that there was no new life waiting for him around the next bend in the road, which was the message of his writing and the dream by which he coped with his troubles. Ultimately, Leary, in flashbacks, concluded that Kerouac couldn't let go of his old-time Catholicism and embrace the tenets of the New Age they were creating. He said that Kerouac opened the neural doors to the future, looked ahead, and didn't see his place in it, which is a good insight. It sums it up, really, in a nutshell. Now to come back to Neil Cassady, Kerouac's old buddy, and The Muse for On the Road and other books. Now, Cassady had, in the meantime, unlike Jack, embraced the psychedelic revolution. He'd done mushrooms in Oaxaca and peyote with the Navajo, and he described psilocybin as the Rolls Royce of dope. And in much the same way as he'd naturally slipped into the beat circle in the 1940s, he now teamed up with the next wave of madcap adventurers, Ken Kesey and his merry pranksters. Kesey took the place in Neil's life that Jack once occupied, and unsurprisingly, Jack felt sidelined and disdainful about Neil in this new mode. Also, in the same way as Neil served as a character for Jack, he also became one in Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, the driver of the bus further. When the pranksters came to New York, Neil saw this as a great opportunity to introduce Kesey to Jack, and Ken himself dearly wanted to meet the legend who'd penned On the Road, which should have been another great meeting of two big personalities, but again, it was not to be. In their apartment, the pranksters were high on dope and acid, and they'd draped American flags everywhere, and one was duly tied around Jack's neck. But being an old reactionary, Jack didn't like this gesture and considered it disrespectful. And then he took the flag off and gave them a demonstration of how to fold the flag properly, his po-faced attitude obvious to all. He refused the offer of drugs, and when Ken tried to cheer him up, he hardly reacted. So the get-together wasn't a success, and if anything, it hardened Jack's contempt for the new acid generation. So there you have it. Kerouac was the failure of the beat psychedelic induction process. Ginsberg was the resounding success, and now we come back to Boas, who was the mixed case. And he went into a bit of a tailspin after his excellent pioneering work with Yahe. Now, Leary contacted Boas by letter, and Bill responded enthusiastically, saying his work had benefited measurably from the use of hallucinogens and agreeing to try psilocybin pills within the research project. But Bill's first experience was not a success. It nauseated him and gave him disturbing visions of green boys with purple gills. He'd also been experimenting with DMT, injecting it like junk, saying the results were sometimes unpleasant but always interesting. Shortly afterwards, in the summer of 1961, Leary brought psilocybin to a beat gathering in Tangier that included Boas, Ginsberg, and the writers Paul Bowles and Gregory Corso. They're in that photograph. Bowles and Corso, as well as Ginsberg and Boas. Tim turned them all on with mostly positive results, but unfortunately Bill had another bad reaction. In High Priest, Tim reported that Bill looked haggard and tense, almost collapsed against the wall, and he said, "I would like to sound a word of warning. I'm not feeling too well. I was struck by a juxtaposition of purple fire mushroomed from the pain banks. Urgent warning, I think I'll stay here in shriveling envelopes of larval flesh." Typical Boas bit of prose there. Now, Bill was in a weird psychic space at this time. His cut-up literary experiments had given him a skewed vision of reality, and he saw conspiracy theories everywhere. Psilocybin, DMT, LSD, and other laboratory psychedelics came to register on him as part of the problem rather than part of the solution. When he heard of CIA interest in the mind-controlling potential of acid, it only served to reinforce this viewpoint. Ultimately, he favoured ayahuasca and the high-dose cannabis candy, Majune. However, Bill did get to know Tim better, turning on with him again in London and participating in the American Psychological Association Symposium on Psychedelic Drugs in Manhattan. Bill then witnessed some of Tim's experiments at Harvard, and his reaction was most disapproving. Bill had expected a more scientific approach to psychedelic research, kind of using sensory deprivation tanks and brainwave monitors. But instead he found tripped out encounter sessions involving endless theorizing about universal love, enlightenment, and game theory. Afterwards, Bill published an open letter denouncing the Harvard work, which left him mortified. So Bill, unlike Alan, showed a streak of conservatism towards the peace and love aspect of the psychedelic movement, which can be seen in part generational. So, Ginsberg and Leary's projected merger of the beat and psychedelic words didn't run as smoothly as hoped. There they are, slightly later, at a signing with Patti Smith. But nonetheless, the interaction and cross-fertilization that did take place was most fruitful, with beat philosophy giving the new movement a strong sense of direction. As for Alan himself, he progressively positioned himself centre stage as the 60s cultural revolution went into full swing. He became one of its major movers and shakers and an ambassador for beat mysticism to all, including the most famous. He rubbed shoulders with the Beatles, the Stones, Bob Dylan and the Byrds, while keeping up close involvement with Cassidy, Kesey and Leary, and helping gather support after Tim's drugs bust. He was also very actively political, campaigning for marijuana legislation and taking up anti-capitalist and anti-war stances, a hot issue as the Vietnam conflict escalated. Tom Wolfe captures a snapshot of Alan at this time in the electric Kool-Aid acid test. Then Allen Ginsberg was in front of the microphone with finger symbols on each hand, dancing around with a beard down to his belly and chanting Hindu chants in a microphone, booming out all over California, USA. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. That image of Alan was enshrined in world consciousness after he appeared in the 1967 Human Being in San Francisco. And the media turned photos and cartoons of Alan into emblems for the hippie movement, and he gained the distinction of becoming the one poet of which most everybody had heard. Now, though Bill Boas wasn't anything like as publicly active as Alan in the 60s, but nevertheless he also became a 60s icon, and that was in part due to his friendship with Paul McCartney and him becoming immortalised as one of the figures on the Sgt. Pepper album cover, montaged next to Marilyn Monroe and below Fred Astaire. His fame gradually increased throughout the 60s and 70s, and he became a guru figure to various bands such as Steely Dan, The Soft Machine, Iggy Pop, Patti Smith, Kurt Cobain, and even Duran Duran. And Boas's fame kind of reached a peak in the 90s, which was partly due to David Cronenberg's film version of Naked Lunch, which made Boas, as played by Peter Weller there, with a friendly neighbourhood mugwump, into an icon of weird for a new generation. So the legacy of the Beats extended through the psychedelic era and beyond, and all their major books are still in print and widely read. Jack Kerouac's early death only served to make him more of a legend, and his seductive weave of fact and fiction, mythologizing his famous friends became so, created a feedback loop of endless fascination. Much continues to be written about them, and the pertinence of their activities and writings to today's alternative scene is as strong as ever. Now, the essay that this talk was based on was originally published in the Psychedelic Press magazine, and that essay has been recollected in this anthology Out of the Shadows, which is due to be published in April, but is actually available to buy in the bookstore, I believe. And my own strongly beat-influenced adventures back in the 1970s can be read about in my memoir, The Mad Artist, signed copies of which are also available at the bookstore, and you can get it on Amazon and Kindle.
It's a very good book.
As Rob says, it's a very good book, and he reviewed it. So there you go. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for finished on time.